Maybe if you smiled more, people would actually want to be served by you. The words landed sharp and careless, slicing through the soft hum of the aircraft cabin at 35,000 feet, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause, like the recycled air itself had hesitated to move. Naomi Carter stood still in the aisle, the silver tray balanced in her hand, the faint clink of glass the only sound that dared continue. Her navy uniform pressed to perfection just minutes earlier, now marked by a slow, spreading stain of champagne that had slipped from the crystal flute in Ethan Whitmore's hand, though no one could quite say if it had slipped or been let go. A few passengers glanced up, then quickly away, eyes retreating to screens and magazines, the quiet social contract of avoidance sealing the moment in a bubble of silence. While across the wide leather seats of first class, Ethan leaned back with the loose confidence of someone who had never been told no, his grin wide, careless, untouched by consequence. And beside him, his mother Victoria let out a soft laugh, the kind polished over years of private clubs and charity galas, while his father Richard barely looked up from his phone, as if scenes like this were background noise in a life too important to interrupt. Naomi did not react, not immediately, her fingers tightening just slightly around the tray, the cool metal grounding her, her breath measured, slow, controlled, as she registered the weight of the moment not in the words themselves, but in the space they created around her, a space filled with expectation, with judgment, with the quiet pressure to either shrink or respond. The overhead lights cast a warm, artificial glow, reflecting off the polished surfaces, turning everything just a little too perfect, too clean, too detached from the tension threading through the narrow aisle. And Naomi's eyes lifted, steady and calm, meeting Ethan's for just a fraction of a second, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something quieter, something harder to dismiss, a presence that refused to disappear. "Sir, I'll need you to keep your seatbelt fastened as we prepare for departure," she said, her voice even. Professional, carrying just enough authority to be heard but not enough to escalate. And for a heartbeat, it almost felt like the moment could pass, like the aircraft itself might absorb the discomfort and move forward. But Ethan's smile only widened, his fingers tapping lazily against the armrest as if the rules themselves were optional, as if gravity, like consequence, did not fully apply to him. Somewhere toward the front of the cabin, a soft chime echoed, the seatbelt sign illuminating a quiet, glowing reminder that even at this altitude, even in this world of wealth and privilege, there were systems in place, structures that did not bend for laughter or status. And Naomi, still standing there with the faint scent of champagne rising from her uniform, simply adjusted the tray in her hand, her posture straight, her expression composed, as the plane began its slow, steady push back from the gate, carrying everyone on board into a journey none of them fully understood yet. Naomi moved down the aisle with the same measured pace she had practiced for years, each step quiet against the narrow carpet, each motion deliberate, as if the rhythm of her body could steady the tension still hanging in the air. The stain on her uniform had begun to cool against her skin, a faint reminder she chose not to acknowledge, not yet, because there were passengers to serve, procedures to follow, and a system that did not pause for discomfort. And as she reached the galley, she set the tray down with a soft, controlled motion, the metal surface catching the cabin light in a brief flicker before settling into stillness. She exhaled once, slow and silent, then reached for a clean cloth, pressing it gently against the fabric without rushing, without frustration, as though even this small act deserved patience. Behind her, the low hum of the engines deepened as the aircraft began to taxi, a steady vibration that traveled through the floor and into her feet, grounding her in something larger than the moment, something structured and precise, like the rules she had learned to trust. Naomi Carter had spent 12 years in the air, long enough to understand that chaos often wore a polished face, that entitlement could arrive dressed in designer labels and soft laughter, and that dignity was not something given by others, but something carried quietly, consistently, even when no one was watching. She had started at 22, fresh out of a community college program, working double shifts to support her younger brother after their mother passed, learning quickly that professionalism was not just a requirement, but a shield, a way to move through spaces that were not always welcoming without losing herself in the process. A soft voice crackled through the intercom as the captain announced their expected flight time. Just under 3 hours, cruising at 35,000 feet, the familiar cadence of the message blending into the background as Naomi checked the galley inventory with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving over sealed containers, confirming counts, aligning everything just so. Because order mattered here, details mattered, and even the smallest oversight could ripple outward in ways most passengers would never notice. From the corner of her eye, she could still see the Whitmore family, their silhouettes relaxed, unbothered. Ethan now scrolling through his phone with the same careless ease, his earlier words already fading from his expression as though they had never held weight, while Victoria leaned toward him, whispering something that drew another quiet laugh, and Richard finally looked up, not at Naomi, but at the cabin around him, as if assessing the environment rather than acknowledging the people within it. Naomi turned away, not out of avoidance, but out of focus, because her role was clear, her responsibilities defined, and she understood something they did not, that every action on this aircraft was recorded, noted, part of a system designed not for comfort alone, but for safety, for accountability, for moments exactly like this. She reached for the small tablet secured in the galley, its screen lighting up with a soft glow, and with calm precision, she entered a brief note, her touch steady, her expression unchanged, not out of retaliation, not out of emotion, but out of duty, because what happened in this cabin did not simply disappear into the air behind them. It became part of a record, part of a pattern, part of a structure that extended far beyond one flight, one family, one careless moment. The plane paused briefly on the runway, engines rising to a controlled roar, and as Naomi secured the galley for takeoff, her hands moving with quiet certainty, she glanced once more down the aisle, not at Ethan, not at his parents, but at the space itself, at the rows of passengers strapped into their seats, at the glowing seatbelt signs casting a steady amber light. And in that stillness before acceleration, there was something unspoken, something waiting, like the calm edge of a line that, once crossed, could not be undone. The engines surged and the aircraft rolled forward with growing force, the runway lights streaking past in a blur of white and amber, and Naomi stood secured in her jump seat, her hands resting lightly against the harness as the familiar pressure pressed her back, steady and controlled, the kind of power that followed rules, that answered to systems far beyond any single person on board. Across the aisle, Ethan shifted in his seat, one leg bouncing with restless energy, his seatbelt fastened loosely as if even that simple restraint was negotiable, while Victoria adjusted her scarf with practiced elegance, and Richard finally placed his phone away, glancing briefly toward the window as the ground fell away beneath them. The nose of the aircraft lifted, smooth and decisive, and within seconds the city below became a pattern of lights, distant and untouchable, the world shrinking into something abstract, something removed from consequence. And for many on board, that distance brought comfort, but for Naomi, it sharpened focus, because altitude did not remove responsibility, it intensified it. As the plane leveled off and the initial climb stabilized, the seatbelt sign remained illuminated, its soft chime echoing once more through the cabin, a reminder that order still held, that safety was not optional, and Naomi rose when instructed, her movements fluid, professional, stepping back into the aisle with the same calm presence she had carried from the beginning. Her uniform now mostly dry but still marked, a quiet record of what had happened. She approached the Whitmore row again, not with hesitation, not with confrontation, but with duty, stopping at a respectful distance as she spoke clearly. "Sir, we are still under the seatbelt sign. I need you to remain seated with your belts securely fastened." Her tone even, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. And for a brief second, it seemed like the request might be honored, like the moment might pass without escalation. But Ethan let out a short laugh, leaning forward slightly as if amused by the idea of instruction, his fingers already reaching to loosen the belt further, testing boundaries the way he always had, while Victoria watched with a faint smile, not intervening, not correcting, simply observing as though it were all part of a harmless performance. A few rows back, a passenger shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking between Naomi and the scene unfolding, the tension subtle but present, like a low-frequency hum beneath the cabin noise, and Naomi held her ground, not raising her voice, not changing her expression, only repeating, "For your safety and the safety of everyone on board, I need you to comply." The words rooted in policy, in regulation, in a system that did not bend for attitude or wealth. Ethan rolled his eyes, his movements exaggerated now, drawing attention, his knee pressing against the seat in front of him as he adjusted his posture in defiance rather than necessity. And though his actions seemed small, almost trivial, Naomi knew better, because she had seen how quickly small things could become serious at 35,000 feet, how quickly disregard could turn into risk, and her gaze remained steady, not on him alone, but on the situation as a whole, assessing, calculating, documenting in real time. Somewhere above them, the overhead compartments rattled faintly as the aircraft passed through a light pocket of turbulence, the cabin, lights flickering almost imperceptibly before stabilizing again. And in that brief shift, something changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to register, enough for Naomi to feel it, the moment. Tightening, the line drawing itself a little clearer, and without a word, she turned slightly, her hand moving once more toward the secured tablet at her side, her actions quiet, precise, as the system continued to record everything exactly as it happened, whether anyone else chose to notice or not. Naomi did not raise her voice, did not step closer, did not allow the moment to become personal, because she understood something that most people in that cabin did not. That authority in the air was not about dominance. It was about consistency, about holding a line that existed long before this flight and would remain long after it landed. And as Ethan leaned back with a dismissive shrug, his seatbelt now clearly loose against his waist, she simply inclined her head once, a subtle acknowledgement not of agreement, but of decision, then turned and walked back toward the galley with the same calm precision she had maintained from the beginning. Behind her, a faint ripple of whispers moved through a few nearby rows, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal that the moment had been noticed, that the invisible boundary between private behavior and public consequence had begun to shift. And Naomi reached the galley just as another soft chime echoed overhead. The seatbelt sign still glowing, unwavering, its quiet authority filling the space more effectively than any raised voice could. She secured herself briefly against the counter as the aircraft adjusted altitude, a gentle tilt that pressed weight subtly through her frame, and then, with steady hands, she accessed the communication panel, her fingers moving with practiced familiarity, selecting the appropriate channel, logging the continued non-compliance with clear, concise detail, each word chosen. Not for emotion but for accuracy, because accuracy was what systems relied on, what decisions were built upon. A pause followed, not empty but expectant, the kind of silence that carried process within it. And then a soft response came through her headset, the captain's voice calm, controlled, asking for confirmation, for specifics, for sequence, and Naomi provided them without hesitation, her tone even, her focus sharp, describing behavior, timing, and current status, nothing exaggerated, nothing omitted, just truth placed carefully into the structure designed to receive it. From the cabin, Ethan's laughter drifted faintly back, lighter now, almost bored, as though the situation had already lost its entertainment value, while Victoria reached for her drink again, adjusting it on the tray table with delicate precision. And Richard returned to his phone, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly across his face, their world intact, unchanged, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, something had already been set in motion, something procedural, irreversible, not dramatic, not immediate, but certain, like a sequence of locked steps following one another in quiet succession. Naomi removed the headset and placed it back in its holder, her shoulders relaxed but her posture still straight, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself a single breath deeper than the rest, not as relief, but as reset, before stepping once more into the aisle, her presence returning to the flow of service as though nothing had happened. Because professionalism was not about forgetting, it was about continuing, about holding the same standard regardless of circumstance. As she moved past the rows, A passenger offered her a small, respectful nod, almost imperceptible, and she returned it just as subtly. A silent exchange that required no words, and when she reached the Whitmore row again, she did not stop this time, did not engage, only observed in passing, noting posture, behavior, compliance, her gaze steady and brief, collecting what was needed without inviting interaction. Outside the window, the sky stretched vast and uninterrupted, a deep blue fading toward the horizon, the aircraft cutting through it with unwavering direction, and inside, the cabin settled into a rhythm once more, but beneath that rhythm, beneath the quiet conversations and the clink of glass, the system continued to move forward, silent, structured, and inevitable, carrying with it the weight of what had already been decided. The cabin had settled into that fragile illusion of normal, the quiet clink of ice in glasses, the soft murmur of conversations returning as if the earlier tension had simply dissolved into the air. But Naomi knew better, because moments like that did not disappear. They folded into what came next, and as she moved steadily down the aisle once more, offering refills, adjusting tray tables, her awareness remained sharp, tuned not to comfort, but to consistency, to patterns, to shifts that others might miss. Ethan had grown restless again, his posture slouched deeper into the seat, one foot now pressing lightly against the bulkhead in front of him despite the clear signage, his fingers drumming against the armrest in a rhythm that spoke more of impatience than boredom, while Victoria glanced at him briefly, offering no correction, only a faint sigh that carried more indulgence than concern, and Richard, still absorbed in his screen, seemed entirely detached from the space they occupied, as though the aircraft itself were just another extension of his controlled world. Naomi paused a few rows behind them, not approaching directly this time, her gaze steady as she observed the interaction from a distance measured in both steps and judgment, because escalation did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it built in increments, in repeated disregard, in small choices that stacked quietly until they could no longer be ignored. The seatbelt sign remained on, its soft amber glow unchanged, and the aircraft encountered another light pocket of turbulence, a subtle dip, followed by a gentle rise, enough to shift a glass slightly on a tray table, enough to remind every passenger that they were suspended in a space governed by forces beyond their control. And Naomi used that moment, stepping forward again, her voice calm but firmer now. "Sir, I need you to keep your feet down and your seatbelt properly fastened." The words clear, direct, leaving no ambiguity, and this time, Ethan looked at her longer, his expression tightening not with anger, but with something closer to challenge, as if testing how far the line could be pushed before it pushed back. "Relax," he said, his tone light but edged. "It is just a flight." And a few nearby passengers shifted again, the discomfort more visible now, a ripple of awareness passing through the row, and Naomi did not respond to the tone, only to the behavior, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, because she was not there to argue, she was there to enforce, and enforcement did not require volume, only certainty. A brief silence followed, stretched thin between them, and then, with exaggerated reluctance, Ethan adjusted slightly, not fully compliant, but no longer as openly dismissive, a half step back that did not resolve the issue but marked a shift, however small, and Naomi noted it, not as victory, not as defeat, but as data, as part of the ongoing record that was still being written. She turned away once more, her movements smooth, controlled, continuing down the aisle as though the exchange had been routine, because in her world, it was every action documented, every deviation accounted for. And as she reached the galley again, she placed her hand briefly against the counter, feeling the steady vibration of the aircraft beneath her palm, a constant reminder that everything here operated within structure, within limits, within rules that did not bend for attitude or wealth. Beyond the narrow windows, the sky had deepened into a darker shade, the horizon now a thin line of fading light, and inside, the cabin lights adjusted automatically, softening to match the transition, casting a quieter, more subdued glow across the rows. And in that dimmer light, the earlier laughter felt more distant, less certain, as if it belonged to a different moment entirely. while the system that had been set in motion continued forward, silent and precise, carrying with it the weight of every choice that had been made and every consequence that had yet to arrive. The cabin lights dimmed further as the aircraft cruised steadily above the darkened stretch of land below. The world outside reduced to scattered constellations of city lights far beneath them, distant and silent, while inside, everything softened into a quieter rhythm, the hum of the engines now a low, constant presence that seemed to settle into the bones, and Naomi stood near the galley window for just a moment longer than necessary, her reflection faintly visible against the glass, layered over the darkness beyond, her expression calm, composed, but thoughtful, as if she were listening to something deeper than sound. She rolled her shoulders once, slow and subtle, easing the tension that had built not from fear, but from holding steady, from choosing restraint when reaction would have been easier, and her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the counter, feeling the vibration again, grounding herself in the structure she trusted, in the system that did not require her to raise her voice to be heard. Behind her, the cabin had grown quieter, conversations fading into low murmurs, a few passengers already resting, their seats reclined just enough to suggest surrender to the long flight ahead, while others stared at glowing screens, disconnected from the shared space around them. And in the Whitmore row, the energy had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to notice, Ethan no longer laughing, his movements slower now, less performative, though still edged with impatience. While Victoria adjusted a blanket across her lap, her earlier amusement replaced with a more neutral stillness, and Richard remained focused on his phone, though his posture had straightened slightly, as if some part of him had begun to register that the environment was not as entirely under his control as he preferred. Naomi turned back into the aisle, her steps measured, her presence quiet but certain, and as she moved through the rows, she paused briefly beside an elderly passenger who needed assistance with a tray table, her hands gentle, precise, her voice soft, offering help without drawing attention, and the woman gave her a small, grateful smile, the kind that did not ask for anything more than acknowledgement, and Naomi returned it with equal warmth, a simple exchange that carried more weight than any earlier words spoken in arrogance. The contrast lingered as she continued forward, not as judgment, but as clarity, as a reminder that respect did not depend on status, only on choice. She reached the midpoint of the cabin and paused again, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, letting the moment breathe, letting the quiet settle fully, and for a brief stretch of time, nothing happened, no raised voices, no disruption, only the steady continuation of flight. And in that stillness, something shifted, not in the passengers, not in the visible space, but in the unseen process moving beneath it all, the reports logged, the communication completed, the sequence already advancing step by step toward its conclusion. Naomi's gaze moved once more toward the Whitmore row, not lingering, not confrontational, just observant, confirming posture, confirming compliance, confirming that the line, once tested, had been acknowledged, even if reluctantly, and she nodded almost imperceptibly to herself, not in satisfaction, but in recognition that the moment had passed into the next phase, the quiet space where consequences take shape without announcement. Outside, the horizon had fully disappeared into darkness. The aircraft now surrounded by an endless stretch of night, guided only by instruments, by systems, by invisible pathways mapped long before this flight ever began, and inside, Naomi resumed her steady pace, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged, carrying with her the same calm presence, because she understood that what mattered most was not the moment of tension, but what came after it, the way one held steady, the way one continued forward, and in that quiet, controlled movement, there was a strength that did not need to be spoken, only maintained. The first sign did not come from the cabin but from the voice overhead, calm and measured, cutting gently through the quiet like a line drawn with precision. Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our initial descent, please ensure your seat belts are securely fastened and all carry-on items are properly stowed. And the words settled over the passengers with a weight that felt different this time, not heavier, but more defined, as if the end of the flight had begun to reveal something the middle had concealed. Naomi paused mid-aisle, her hand resting lightly on the back of a seat, feeling the subtle shift in the aircraft as it angled downward, a smooth, controlled descent that pressed ever so slightly against the body, and she lifted her gaze, scanning the rows with practiced clarity, confirming compliance, confirming order, her presence quiet but attentive. In the Whitmore row, the change was subtle at first, Ethan straightening just a little, his earlier restlessness replaced by a quieter stillness, his fingers no longer drumming, his posture less performative, while Victoria adjusted her seat upright, smoothing the fabric of her outfit with careful movements that suggested awareness rather than ease, and Richard finally set his phone aside completely, his attention no longer divided, his eyes moving toward the aisle with a focus that had not been there before. Naomi approached once more, her steps even, her tone consistent. "Sir, I need your seatbelt secured properly for landing." And this time, there was no laugh, no dismissal, only a brief pause. A flicker of hesitation that passed quickly but did not go unnoticed, and Ethan reached down, pulling the belt tighter across his lap, the click of the latch settling into place with a quiet finality that seemed louder than it should have been. Naomi gave a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, and continued forward, her attention shifting to the rest of the cabin. But something had already changed, something that did not reverse what had happened, but reframed it, placing it into a sequence that was nearing completion. The aircraft descended through a layer of thin clouds, the windows briefly filling with soft gray before clearing again, revealing the scattered lights of the city below growing larger, closer, more defined, and inside. The cabin adjusted accordingly, seats upright, tray tables secured, conversations minimal, the atmosphere tightening into focus, and Naomi moved through it all with the same calm precision, checking, confirming, ensuring that every detail aligned with protocol. In the forward galley, a quiet exchange passed between crew members, brief, professional, their voices low but certain, a final confirmation of information already known, already processed, and Naomi listened without reacting, her expression unchanged, because the outcome had never depended on emotion, only on process, and that process was now complete. As the landing gear extended with a distant mechanical hum, a vibration traveling faintly through the cabin floor, the reality of arrival settled in, not just as a destination, but as a transition point, the moment where everything recorded, everything observed, would step out of the air and into something more concrete. And Naomi took her position once more, seated, secured, her hands resting lightly, her posture straight, her gaze forward, as the runway lights came into view, stretching out in parallel lines of white and red, guiding the aircraft down with unwavering precision. Across the aisle, Ethan sat still, his earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, less certain, while Victoria's hands remained folded in her lap, and Richard's gaze stayed fixed ahead, no longer detached. And in that shared silence, as the plane descended steadily toward the ground, there was a realization forming, not spoken, not fully understood yet, but present, like the final seconds before touchdown, when everything aligns and there is no longer any space left to ignore what is about to happen. The wheels touched the runway with a firm, controlled impact, a brief shudder running through the cabin as rubber met asphalt, followed by the steady roar of reverse thrust, the aircraft decelerating with precision, every movement calculated, every force managed, and inside, no one spoke. The moment holding its own gravity as the plane transitioned from air to ground, from suspension to consequence. Naomi remained seated, her posture unchanged, her gaze forward, feeling the vibration beneath her settle into a slower rhythm, the runway lights passing in measured intervals outside the window, until finally, the aircraft eased into a smooth taxi, the engines softening, the tension shifting from anticipation to something quieter, something waiting. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated, its amber glow steady, and the cabin stayed still, passengers restrained not just by instruction but by something unspoken, a shared awareness that the journey was not quite over, not yet. In the Whitmore row, Ethan sat upright, his earlier ease gone, replaced by a stillness that felt unfamiliar, his hands resting where they had not before, not moving, not testing. while Victoria kept her eyes forward, her expression composed but tighter, and Richard's jaw had set in a way that suggested calculation rather than confidence, his attention now fully anchored in the space around him, as if sensing that control had shifted beyond his reach. The aircraft turned slowly toward the gate, the terminal lights coming into view, bright and structured, lines of glass and steel reflecting back the reality that awaited. And as the plane came to a final stop, the engines idled down to a low hum, the familiar chime sounding overhead as the seatbelt sign switched off. But no one moved immediately. Not this time. The usual rush delayed by a pause that stretched just long enough to matter. The cabin door remained closed for a moment longer than expected, and then, with a soft mechanical release, it opened, letting in a different kind of air, cooler, grounded, carrying with it the presence of something beyond the aircraft itself. And Naomi rose with the rest of the crew, her movements smooth, practiced, her expression calm as she stepped into position near the forward section, her hands lightly folded, her posture composed. From the open doorway, two uniformed airport officials stepped inside, their presence quiet but unmistakable, not rushed, not aggressive, simply certain, their eyes scanning the cabin with purpose before settling toward the front rows, and a subtle shift moved through the passengers, a ripple of attention that required no announcement. Naomi did not look at them directly, did not signal, did not react, because she did not need to. The process had already been set in motion long before the plane had touched the ground, and as the officials approached the Whitmore row, their steps measured, their expressions neutral, the silence deepened. No laughter now, no dismissive gestures, only the sound of controlled breathing and the faint hum of a completed flight. Ethan looked up first, confusion flickering across his face, followed quickly by something less certain, while Victoria's posture stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of her seat just slightly, and Richard straightened fully, his composure returning in appearance but not in ease, his eyes narrowing as he registered the situation unfolding in front of him. One of the officials spoke in a calm, professional tone, requesting their attention, requesting their cooperation, and the words, though quiet, carried weight, not because of how they were said, but because of what they represented. A system that did not argue, did not negotiate in the moment, only followed through. Naomi remained where she was, her gaze directed slightly past the scene, not avoiding, not engaging, simply present, as the boundary between action and consequence completed its final step. And in the stillness that followed, there was no need for explanation, no need for raised voices, only the unmistakable shift of power, silent, structured, and absolute. No one clapped, no one whispered, no one even shifted in their seats as the officials stood beside the Whitmore family, because the silence had become something else now, something heavier, something that carried the weight of recognition, and Ethan's earlier confidence seemed to dissolve in that space, his eyes moving between the two uniformed figures as if searching for a familiar rule that no longer applied, while Victoria's composed expression held, but only just, the edges of it tightening, in a way that revealed the effort beneath. And Richard, for the first time since boarding, said nothing at all, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed forward as though refusing to acknowledge what was unfolding would somehow delay it. The official repeated the request calmly, professionally, outlining the need for them to remain seated for a moment longer, explaining that further steps would be handled at the gate, and the words were not loud, not forceful, but they carried an authority that did not require emphasis, because it was backed by something far larger than the moment, something procedural, documented, irreversible. Naomi stood a few steps away, her presence unchanged, her hands resting lightly in front of her, her breathing steady, and she did not look directly at the family, not out of avoidance, but because the moment was no longer hers. It belonged to the system now, to the structure that had taken everything she had recorded and moved it forward with quiet certainty. Passengers began to gather their belongings slowly, carefully, but the usual impatience was absent, replaced by a subdued awareness that something significant had occurred, something that did not need to be explained for it to be understood. And as the line began to form in the aisle, it curved naturally around the Whitmore row, creating a subtle distance, not out of hostility, but out of recognition. Ethan lowered his gaze, his hands now still in his lap, the earlier defiance gone without ceremony. While Victoria adjusted her posture once more, her movements precise but restrained, and Richard finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath that seemed to acknowledge what he could no longer ignore. The officials remained steady, waiting, allowing the process to unfold in its own time, and when the aisle cleared enough, they gestured gently, indicating the next step, their tone unchanged, their presence consistent, and the family rose, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a measured hesitation that had not been there before. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, creating space, her movement smooth, unobtrusive, and as they passed, she did not speak, did not react, only remained as she had been from the beginning, composed, present, unwavering, and for a brief moment, as Ethan moved past her, his eyes lifted, not fully, not directly, but enough to register her presence, enough to recognize that the person he had dismissed had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. Beyond the open aircraft door, the terminal lights stretched bright and clear, the polished floor reflecting each step as the officials guided the family forward, their figures gradually blending into the structured flow of the airport, where systems continued, where records mattered, where actions carried forward into consequence. Inside the cabin, the movement resumed, passengers stepping into the aisle, conversations returning in low tones, but something had shifted, something subtle yet lasting, and Naomi turned back toward the galley, her steps steady, her posture relaxed but aligned, and as she reached for a fresh cloth, gently pressing it once more against the faint mark on her uniform, the fabric cool against her skin, the last trace of the earlier moment, she did not rush, did not force it to disappear, because she understood that not everything needed to be erased to be resolved. Outside, another aircraft moved slowly along the taxiway, its lights cutting through the night with quiet purpose, and inside, Naomi finished her motion, setting the cloth aside, her hands still, her breath even, as the cabin settled into its final calm, and in that quiet, there was no triumph, no celebration, only the steady presence of something stronger than either, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood, the simple, undeniable weight of dignity held, and justice carried out in silence.